Hi everyone, welcome back. Today's topic is the minimum wage. So this is a great topic. It's been in the news a lot lately. The minimum wage is an example of an intervention in the market that is a price floor. It's a price floor because it's a legal minimum that you can pay. And you can pay higher wages, but you can't pay anything less than the existing minimum wage. Now, the minimum wage has sort of winners and losers, and some people who have jobs, low-skilled jobs that pay low wage, their wage will go up. But we know that the demand for things is downward sloping, and if you have a downward sloping demand curve, then it's the businesses in this case who are hiring workers at higher wages. They may want fewer workers. Right? They may substitute to other ways of producing. So that gives us the cartoon that's here. They say, the guy who's labeled small business owner says, I have good news and bad news. The good news is the minimum wage is going up. The bad news is I can't afford to hire you at that wage. Right? So that's just an example of one of the costs of the minimum wage. We'll look at that a little more in conjunction with the graph. So let's look at a graph for the market for low-skilled labor. So it's our regular supply and demand graph. Straighten that up. There we go. On the horizontal axis, we'll label the quantity of labor. On the vertical axis, that's the price, or specifically when we're talking about labor, we can call that the wage, right? The wage is just a specialized name for price when you're talking about labor. And I'm going to label the market that we're talking about. This is the market for low-skilled labor. So there's a demand for labor, and it's downward sloping. Right? So there's the demand for labor. There's a supply of labor, right? And at higher wages, more people are willing to bring labor to the market. So just keep in mind, let me use a different color and sort of just make this note over here. The demand for labor, this comes from the firms, right? This is the firms. These are the employers. Right? And the supply of labor, that comes from the workers. Right? So this is a resource market. This puts us as individuals on the other side of the market from most of the examples that we have used. Most of the examples we've used so far, we talk about pizza, you can talk about sneakers, you can talk about sweatshirts, you can talk about housing. Right? We are, as individuals, consumers of those. We show up on the demand curve, right? How much am I willing to pay for pizza? How many pizzas do I want to buy at this price? But in this case, this is a resource market. We are the laborers. We bring labor to the market, so we're the suppliers. And the firms, right, the employers, the people we work for, they are the demanders of labor. And so they're on that side. So there's some market clearing equilibrium wage, and we'll just call this the wage in equilibrium, W sub E. And at that point, the market clears and the quantity of labor supplied is equal to the quantity of labor demanded. Now, the business owners, right, the firms, they get consumer surplus. Oops. Every time they hire someone, I guess I'll have to use it. You can't use the highlighter on black. It doesn't show up. So let's highlight it this way. This represents consumer surplus, right? Everything underneath the demand curve and down to the equilibrium wage, this represents consumer surplus to the firms that hire the workers, right? There are firms who valued workers at points, I'm going to draw dots right on this demand curve, who valued workers at these higher prices, and if they get to pay the equilibrium wage, they're made better off by that difference, right? And so that's an area of consumer surplus. There's also an area of producer surplus that accrues to us as the individuals. Right? And so to the extent that there are some people who would have come to work for very, very low wages, and if they get paid W sub E, then they're made better off by that difference in between. Right? So producers, right, of labor, that's us, we're made better off by that difference. But what if we don't like this outcome, right? What if people say, well, that wage, that market clearing wage is just too low. Right? That's not fair or just or right, that these hardworking people in these low-skill jobs, they should earn more. And so we're going to fix it by statute. We're going to create legislation, a minimum wage law, that says everyone, in whatever low-skill job should earn at least this much. And so we're going to institute a price floor. So let me pick, we'll stick with yellow. So if this is binding, if it has some effect on the market, it has to be higher than the equilibrium wage. So remember, it's a price floor, but for it to be effective, the floor has to be above. It's going to the equilibrium wage. It's going to prevent the wage from falling all the way down to W sub E. So let's draw in a minimum wage here. Let me see if I can do it just a little bit straighter, or if everything works out a lot straighter. There we go. That snap feature. That's a pretty good straight line right there. So this is going to be our minimum wage, right? So this is a price floor because it's illegal to pay people less than this. So it's been in the news a lot lately. Let's call this $15. Let's suggest that the minimum wage should be $15. Well, what happens? Several things happen. We're going to look at a lot of those right here. But one of them is, and this is what's alluded to in the cartoon above, from the firm side, they're like, at this higher price, right, the demand curve is downward sloping, and at this higher price, we're going to figure out how to get by with fewer people. I didn't label this one before, right? Here was the quantity of labor in equilibrium. This is the quantity of workers we want to hire with the minimum wage, right? So the quantity of workers we hire with the minimum wage is smaller than it was before. But how many people want to work at $15 an hour? Well, everybody who worked before plus all of these people on this part of the supply curve, right? At $15, right, the upward sloping supply curve, actually, they should be more specific. This is what I drew before is the quantity demanded at the minimum wage. This is the quantity supplied at the minimum wage. And they're not the same. The market does not clear, right? There is a discrepancy between this. And you know that where the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, you have a surplus. Now, we have a special name, right? When we're talking about a labor market, we have a special name for the surplus in that situation. It's called unemployment. Right? Unemployment is that situation. So this is surplus or unemployment, right? Let me put this in parentheses. The concept is not called surplus unemployment. There are two different ways of describing it. In generic terms, we'd say there's a surplus, but more specifically in the labor market, we can call that those people who would like to work, who can't find work, they're unemployed. So that's one of the implications of a binding minimum wage. Now, there are benefits. Like why do people want to have a minimum wage? It's because the people who are working then earn more than they did before, right? So for these people who are working, they don't get paid WE, they get paid this higher minimum wage, right? Which in our example, we made $15 an hour. So this whole area right here represents additional, usually I think the apostrophe would go after the T. I don't know why, in my abbreviation. Additional producer surplus, right, in this box right here. And where did it come from? Well, it was part of consumer surplus before. This is gains that would have accrued to the employers, the firms, that now gets transferred to the workers. And this is the whole reason that people like the minimum wage, right? They're saying you're taking money from the producers and you're making them pay more of that out to the workers. Well, I said producers, I should have said firms, the employers, because in this case, the producers of labor are us. So at any rate, the workers get more, and that comes from their employers. So there's a transfer, right? Some consumer surplus is lost and gets transferred to producers. That's sort of the goal of it, but there's another problem, right? There's another cost here, and that is there is potential consumer surplus in here, and potential producer surplus in here, right? In this triangle and this triangle, which put together makes one big triangle. And that area of consumer surplus and that area of producer surplus is lost because these people right here who would have had jobs at the old equilibrium wage, W sub E, no longer have jobs. And to the extent that those people don't have jobs anymore, if there's no hiring of these people, there's no surplus from their employment, right? So all of this particular surplus goes away. You may remember by now we call that deadweight loss. So there is a deadweight loss because there's surplus that's lost that's not picked up by another party, and this is what concerns the economists most. Right? It's sort of an equity, a fairness decision, or question, I should say, about who should get the surplus. But when at least, whether it's the consumer or the producer, whether it's the firm or the employee, at least the surplus exists, right? The economic surplus is out there. Somebody captures it. The deadweight loss is the problem that troubles economists even more because it means it's gone away. So, several things to notice there, right? The deadweight loss, the transfer. But then here's the other thing. Why, if the red arrow that I drew in there, if that represents people who essentially lost their jobs or now can't find jobs who would have been working before, where does the rest of the unemployment come from? Well, it comes from, let's pick a different color here. It comes from this part of the supply curve right here. So who are these people? These are people who are not willing to work at the equilibrium wage, at W sub E. So at whatever the market clearing wage is, these people on the supply curve by the little green X's that I just drew in there, they're not interested. Right? Their reservation wage, their willingness to come to work, their opportunity cost is higher than that. But whenever it goes up to $15, they're like, yeah, I think I might be interested. I could be interested in working there. Now, I'm going to paint with a broad brush and sort of provide an illustration of who these could be. Some of these people could be. This is very generalized, but I think of these people as stay-at-home parents and retired people. And people who are, so if you're retired, you have enough money to get by on from your retirement and Social Security, and you've quit your full-time work and you're enjoying life. But it's always fun to have a little extra money, right? For maybe you just like getting out and being social and hanging out with other people and interacting. Whatever the reason, you might be interested in some low-skilled but sort of low-stress, part-time, 15 or 20 hours a week, retail or something, and it's fun to get out and people, and you make some extra money. You take a nice cruise or something as a result of it. Maybe you're a stay-at-home parent. You have a lot to do. Stay-at-home parents have a lot of responsibility, managing the home, keeping the kids on track, right? Driving the soccer, carpool. So they have a lot of responsibility, a lot of work to do, but maybe during the school year, in the middle of the day, a few days a week, they're actually happy to get out of the house for 4 to 6 hours, and put in some time, earn some extra money for, whatever their family might be interested in. But below a certain wage, they're like, it's just not worth it. I have too much other stuff to do. But at this higher wage, they jump in. So I like to think of them as examples of where the rest of this unemployment comes from. Now, why is that important? Well, because this graph, is what we see here, this I think of as the best case scenario. Because if you're going to have a minimum wage, right, this area, let's use a lighter, that is a lighter purple, isn't it? No, that's the same one. But this area of producer surplus, the remaining part of the original producer surplus plus the new producer surplus, right, the additional producer surplus, that's a best case scenario, because that is all based on the idea that the people who have those jobs are these people with the lowest opportunity cost. They're on this part of the supply curve. But who else is interested in those jobs, right? The available jobs go from 0 to here, to the quantity demanded, right, with the minimum wage. Who else is interested in those jobs? All of these people, right? Everybody along the supply curve from QD all the way up to QS, all the way up to here. So where I put that sort of pink bracket, all of those people would like those jobs too. But if they get one of those jobs, if this person right here, I'm going to circle one of those green X's. If that person gets the job instead of, say, this person down here, I need a different color to highlight this. Instead of this person right here, where I put the green arrow, if the person in the arrow, that's a circle. If the person in the green circle doesn't get the job, loses the job to the person in the pink circle, then all of this potential surplus up to about here goes away, right? Now, I'm not going to ask you to reproduce, this, but just understand that This area, this trapezoid in purple with the bars and the crosshatches, that assumes that all of these jobs are still obtained by the people with the lowest opportunity costs. Anytime somebody with a higher opportunity cost gets the job instead of them, the producer surplus is actually less, right, than it otherwise would be. And so, what are the implications of this from a policy perspective? Some of the empirical studies suggest that the unemployment effects of the minimum wage are not huge, at least for reasonable increases in the minimum wage and in the short term. They suggest that a higher minimum wage doesn't lead to massive unemployment, just sort of marginal increases in unemployment. So that's, I guess, good, right, in terms of if you're interested in if you're looking for reasons to support the minimum wage. But a concern is that's less true, right, the larger the increase. So if there were no significant cost to raising the minimum wage, and in terms of the value, then why stop at 15? Why not 20? Why not 50? Why not 100? Right? Why be cheap? Like $100 minimum wage, everybody should earn a great salary. Well, that doesn't work, right? That a lot of people would lose their jobs. So at high, the increased size of the minimum wage will lead to larger unemployment effects. But then also, even for the smaller ones, those unemployment effects, empirically, it looks like they fall especially hard on young people and minorities. And so some of the very people who you're most interested in helping, minorities and young folks, may be the ones most susceptible to losing their jobs or not getting hired. It may not be that there are massive layoffs, because a lot of these people are in jobs where there's a high turnover rate anyway. So it might not be that the local McDonald's lays a bunch of people off. It might be that they just stop hiring as many people right at the higher minimum wage, because there's a natural attrition that tends to be higher in some of these jobs than in professional jobs. So either way, that I think is a concern. And then another sort of policy implication or secondary effect of this: how many of us are we're as productive, had as good work ethic, we're as mature about working hard when we got our first job at 15, 16, 17 years old as we are now. Some of you may say, yeah, I was a pretty good worker, even when I got my first job. That's great. Many of us weren't, right? Many of us had some maturing and some learning to do. And this goes back to this picture, right? If young people, especially, and minorities, so young minorities, don't have the same opportunities to get these first jobs, low pay, admittedly, but the jobs where the employer, because of the low pay, will be a little bit more understanding and forgiving, and maybe help you develop some of the work ethic. Does that have lasting effects down the road? If we make it harder for young people to get the first jobs that help them, grow and learn about work ethic, does that have implications down the road on their employment trajectory? I don't know. Something to think about, though. So there you go. That's in a nutshell the minimum wage. If you guys have questions, don't hesitate to follow up. Otherwise, I look forward to chatting with you again in the next.